The story of public housing in New York began with a single truth. The city reached a point where private homes failed to protect its people. This truth shaped the streets, the laws, and the lives of thousands of families. It pushed leaders, reformers, and neighbors to face conditions that had been ignored for decades. This video follows those early years when change started as a slow spark in dark and crowded rooms. In the early 1800s, New York grew at a pace that surprised the nation. Ships arrived each week with newcomers searching for hope, safety, or new beginnings. The city spread upward and outward, but its housing did not grow with the same care. Rooms meant for one family held 3, and some buildings had no windows at all. You can still feel the tension in the old reports from city inspectors. They wrote about hallways with no air. They wrote about families who shared one sink with dozens of neighbors. They wrote about children who slept in corners because the rooms were too crowded. It mattered because the city understood that crowded rooms spread disease. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis grew fast in those spaces. Doctors warned city officials that no cure could stop these illnesses if people had no space or clean air. This warning planted the first small seed of reform. Newspapers uncovered more. Riders walked through the blocks south of Houston Street and near the Bowery. They saw factory workers and recent immigrants paying high rents for rooms with broken floors. Their stories began to shift public opinion. One simple question spread among the public: how much can a city ask its people to endure before it must act? That question became the quiet heartbeat of early housing reform. By the 1830s and 1840s, New York officials started to track housing conditions. The city did not yet have a full plan to fix the crisis. Still, it created small rules to prevent the worst hazards. For example, buildings had to provide at least one outdoor toilet per set of families. These early rules helped only a little. Landlords found ways to avoid them. They built more rear houses behind existing buildings. These hidden structures held families in rooms with little daylight and poor air. As the decades passed, New York's population continued to rise. Waves of new immigrants arrived from Ireland, Germany, and other parts of Europe. They needed homes, and the cheapest rooms were the most crowded. This pushed many families into the worst buildings in the city. The tension grew as reformers gained more proof that unsafe buildings harmed everyone. Disease spread from crowded neighborhoods to wealthier areas. Factories could not keep workers healthy. Hospitals filled faster than they could treat people. These truths made housing a problem that the city could not ignore. Reformers knew they needed more than small rules. They needed a new system. Several people shaped the early fight for better housing. Their work set the path for public housing in New York. Dr. Stephen Smith, a surgeon, played a major role. He gathered data on disease in crowded neighborhoods. His report showed a strong connection between poor housing and short lifespans. City leaders could not dismiss the numbers he shared. Another key figure was Jacob Riis, a police reporter and photographer. He documented the worst conditions in the tenements. His book, How the Other Half Lives, used clear language and photographs to show the truth. His work reached the public and city leaders with a force that no report had achieved before. Riis walked into basements where dozens slept on the floor. He saw children working long hours, then returning to rooms with no fresh air. His writing carried a calm tone, but the facts created a strong emotional impact. His work led many New Yorkers to admit that the crisis was real. Lawrence Vellier, a social worker, also became important. He helped write the Tenement House Act of 1901. This law required better sanitation, safer building plans, and better fire protection. It became one of the most important early turning points. These three figures, Smith, Reese, and Vellier, did not solve the crisis alone, but they built the foundation for the first real reforms. Their work proved that housing was not just a private matter. It affected public health, safety, and the future of the city. By the 1880s and 1990s, the tension reached a peak. The population kept rising. Tenement blocks grew taller and more crowded. Families lived in fear of fires, sickness, and eviction. City inspectors knew the situation. They wrote detailed notes on the poor conditions. They warned about wooden staircases that collapsed. They warned about dark rooms that trapped smoke during fires. The city council reviewed these reports. There was pressure from reform groups, churches, and newspapers. But landlords had strong influence. Debates lasted for years. The city hesitated because strong reforms could reduce profits for property owners. Some officials feared backlash. Others feared that improving conditions would raise costs for tenants. This debate slowed change and deepened frustration. At the same time, new studies confirmed the impact of bad housing on children. Medical experts showed that children in the worst tenements grew slower, had weaker lungs, and missed more school days. Teachers reported that many children arrived hungry or too tired to learn. These reports added more pressure for change. The city now faced a clear choice. It could stay on the same path, or it could build a new system of safe and affordable homes. This choice would shape the next century. Before New York built its first public housing development, it tested smaller solutions. Reformers created model tenements, private buildings designed with better standards. These projects aimed to show that safer housing could still be affordable. One of the best-known examples was the Phipps houses, built in the early 1900s. They had clean hallways, proper ventilation, and shared courtyards. Rent stayed low enough for many working-class families. These buildings proved that safe homes were possible. Still, model tenements could not serve the entire population. They helped only a small number of families. Most people remained in buildings with poor conditions. The model tenements raised hope, but at the same time, they highlighted the scale of the problem. City leaders realized that private builders would not fix the crisis alone. Too many families needed homes. Too many buildings needed repairs that private owners would not make. This pushed the city toward a new and bold idea. The idea was simple but controversial. Should the government build homes for the people? This question created debate across New York. Some feared that government-built housing would harm private markets. Others argued that the city had a duty to protect its residents. The shift began with a quiet but firm truth. New York reached a moment when private efforts could not solve the housing crisis alone. This was not an opinion. It was the message from years of studies, reports, and public pressure. The city had to decide if it would step into a role it had never taken before. At the turn of the 20th century, many New Yorkers hoped the Tenement House Act of 1901 would solve the worst problems. The law brought better windows, fire safety rules, and sanitation standards. But it could not fix the deep roots of the crisis. Old buildings stayed overcrowded, and landlords resisted expensive improvements. Inspectors returned with troubling reports. They saw families still living in rooms without enough air. They saw buildings with unsafe stairways and narrow hallways. They knew that new rules did not change old structures. The city needed new homes, not only new rules. This idea stood at the center of many debates. Some people believed the government had no place in building homes. Others argued the crisis would continue for generations without direct action. The tension grew as New York's population kept rising. Immigrants continued to arrive. Factories expanded. Workers filled neighborhoods that had no space left. Reform leaders warned that small steps would not fix the disaster. They called for a bold plan to build new homes with safe standards and fair rents. Their voices gained strength in newspapers, public speeches, and committees. The idea moved from the edge of public debate to the center. The critical moment arrived in 1934. During this time, the nation faced the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment rose. Families who once stayed above poverty slipped into hardship. President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched a series of programs to rebuild the country. Housing was one of the problems he aimed to address. New York leaders took this chance to push for a local housing agency. Their goal was to create an institution with the power to plan, build, and manage safe homes. That year, the city established the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA. It became the first agency of its kind in the United States. Its mission was clear: build homes for families who paid high rents but lived in unsafe conditions. This moment marked a historic shift in the city's responsibility. NYCHA began with strong leadership. One of the key figures was Langdon Post, a reform-minded civic leader. He believed safe homes supported public health and social stability. He pushed the agency to plan projects based on data, fairness, and long-term goals. Another important figure was Mary Simkovich, a settlement house leader. She spent years studying how housing affected families and communities. She argued that new developments should offer open space, clean air, and community services. Her ideas shaped early guidelines for NYCHA's plans.
With the agency now in place, New York faced a new question. What should the first public housing development look like? The first major test came fast. NYCHA selected a site on the Lower East Side. It planned to replace old tenements with a new project called First Houses. This project opened the door to a new era in the city's history. But the path was not smooth. Workers began to tear down the old buildings. They discovered structural problems that made the job harder than expected. The foundations were weaker than the city had thought. The cost of rebuilding soared above the early budget. Some officials questioned if the entire effort was worth the expense. Others pushed forward, insisting that the project could not fail. This became a quiet but intense struggle inside city offices. Failure would threaten the future of all public housing plans. NYCHA chose a careful strategy. The agency kept some exterior walls from the old buildings to lower costs. It rebuilt the interiors with new layouts, better ventilation, and stronger materials. This approach balanced financial limits with the need for safe homes. When First Houses opened in 1935, it made history. It became the first public housing development in the United States. Families moved into apartments with clean kitchens, safe stairways, and fresh air. For many, this was their first home that met basic health standards. Reports from residents showed real emotional relief. Parents felt safer. Children had more space to sleep, study, and play. Doctors recorded improvements in health among families who moved in. The success of First Houses confirmed that public housing could work. It became a symbolic moment that pushed New York to expand its plans. After First Houses, NYCHA moved fast. The agency studied neighborhoods in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. It selected areas where old tenements were most unsafe. It created plans for new developments that followed strict safety rules. One important project was the Harlem River Houses, opened in 1937.
It was funded through a federal program that aimed to support African American families who faced discrimination and poor housing conditions. The development offered open courtyards, modern apartments, and strong community support services. It became a national model for quality housing design. Another project was the Williamsburg Houses, also opened in 1937. It reflected a modern design with clean lines and wide green areas. Architects hoped the open spaces would improve health and community life. These ideas came from years of research, not from trial and error. These developments carried a deep message. Public housing was not only a shelter, it was a commitment to health, dignity, and stability. For many families, it marked the first chance to escape unsafe living conditions. But each project also brought challenges. Costs remained high. Political debates continued. Some landlords argued that public housing would harm private markets. Others feared that better standards in public developments would force private buildings to improve. This could raise their expenses and reduce their profits. Inside the government, debates continued. Some officials believed the city should build many new developments. Others wanted small, limited projects. These debates affected budgets and planning schedules. NYCHA leaders pushed through these barriers. They used data to justify their plans. They presented reports that showed the health benefits of safe homes. They argued that strong public housing supported the entire city, not only the families who lived in the developments. This period became one of slow and steady progress. Projects opened across the city. Families moved out of dangerous buildings. Children entered homes with better air, cleaner water, and safer structures. At the same time, researchers studied the effects of these developments. Their findings supported the early goals of NYCHA. They recorded higher school attendance. They recorded improvements in physical health. They recorded more stable family life. These results pushed the city to continue its efforts. But a larger shift was coming. It would reshape public housing for decades. The great build-out of public housing in New York started with a clear promise. The city would protect families who had no safe place to go. This promise grew during a period of national change. It carried hope, strength, and urgency. But the path forward also exposed new tensions that the early planners had not expected. When World War II ended, New York entered a new housing crisis. Millions of soldiers came home across the country. Many returned to New York with families or plans to start new ones. They searched for homes that they could afford. Private builders could not keep up with demand. Construction materials were tight. Prices rose fast. Families waited for months for apartments that cost more than they could pay. Public housing became a solution. NYCHA already had experience from the early projects. The agency now had public trust, strong planners, and a clear record of success. People looked to it for answers. Federal programs supported this push. Congress passed new housing laws that funded local authorities. These programs aimed to reduce slums and replace unsafe buildings. New York was ready to act. During this period, the city approved new projects at a rapid pace. Developments rose in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. Families moved from cold-water flats to apartments with better air, safer walls, and clean bathrooms. For many, it was the first time they lived in a home built with their needs in mind. But behind this progress, new pressures formed. These pressures would shape the future of public housing in ways few people saw coming. As demand for housing grew, NYCHA faced a difficult problem. The agency had to build fast, but it also had to follow high standards. Balancing speed with quality became a daily challenge. Costs rose with each new project. Labor shortages slowed construction. City officials worried about budgets. Federal rules shifted with new political debates. There were also early questions about income limits. Public housing was meant for working families who paid too much rent for poor homes. But as the economy changed, some families improved their earnings. Should they stay in public housing? Should the city encourage them to leave? These questions did not have easy answers.
Planners also saw that some developments were far from jobs and transportation. Families struggled with long commutes. This problem grew as more projects rose on large, cleared sites that once held older buildings. Tension increased. NYCHA pushed for balanced planning, but city politics made this difficult. Still, the basic goal stayed firm: build safe homes for people who needed them.
Several people shaped public housing during this period. Their choices influenced the next generation of developments. One important figure was Robert Moses. He held several powerful positions that oversaw parks, highways, and construction. He supported the clearance of old tenements to make room for new housing projects. This gave NYCHA access to large parcels of land. But Moses also had strong views on how land should be used. He encouraged wide-open areas between buildings. He favored tall structures that freed space at ground level. These choices shaped the look of many developments. Another key figure was Felix Wurmser, a federal housing official. He worked to secure funding for local authorities. His decisions influenced which projects moved forward and which ones waited. His support during budget battles helped New York maintain its building pace. Local planners and architects also played important roles. They studied how families used their homes. They adjusted building designs to improve air, light, and safety. Many of these changes came from research, not guesswork. These figures made public housing a strong part of New York's landscape. But the choices they made also carried consequences that took years to unfold. During the late 1940s and 1950s, the city embraced a policy called slum clearance. This effort aimed to remove unsafe tenements and replace them with modern housing. It was supported by federal laws that funded demolition and rebuilding. New York used these programs more than any other city. NYCHA worked closely with city officials during this period. They identified blocks with the worst buildings. They removed large areas of old housing. They built new developments with clean designs, strong materials, and shared outdoor space. For many families, this was a dramatic change. They moved from dark rooms to apartments with windows in every bedroom. They gained access to courtyards, community rooms, and safer streets. Health reports from this period showed real improvements for new residents. But the clearance process also created challenges. It displaced many families before new apartments were ready. Some had to move to temporary homes. Some moved far from their old neighborhoods. This caused stress and hardship during the transition. Another issue was scale. Projects grew larger than before. Some developments held thousands of residents. Planners believed this size would support strong communities, but managing these large buildings became a challenge for the future. These early cracks did not stop the progress, but they hinted at problems that would surface later. Families who moved into new developments shared a range of emotions. Some felt relief and pride. They had clean halls, working elevators, and safe play areas. Children formed new friendships in shared courtyards. Parents spoke about better sleep, fewer illnesses, and calmer days. They no longer feared broken stairs or leaking roofs. Many kept the new apartments spotless. They treated the space as a rare chance for stability. But other families felt the strain of starting over. Some missed their old neighbors. Some missed the small shops and familiar streets that were torn down. Some struggled with new rules that restricted building use.
NYCHA required strict maintenance routines. It set rules for noise, guests, and shared spaces. These rules helped protect safety, but they also felt restrictive to some residents. This period carried both hope and pressure. The emotions behind these stories shaped public housing far beyond the physical walls. The promise of public housing began with a clear hope. Safe homes would protect families and support strong communities. By the 1960s, this hope was still alive, but the weight of new pressures was impossible to ignore. New York had built one of the largest systems in the world. Now the question was whether the system could hold under rising strain. The city that built the early projects was not the same city that entered the 1960s. Factories closed or moved away. Jobs that once supported working families began to disappear. This shift reshaped many neighborhoods. Public housing residents felt this change first. Many families had relied on stable factory jobs. When those jobs vanished, income fell across entire communities. This changed how families used public housing. NYCHA had been designed for working families with steady pay. Now it served more families who lived on limited incomes. This shift increased the need for support services. It also increased pressure on maintenance budgets. City officials saw the change but struggled to respond. Budgets tightened, costs rose. Federal programs began to shift their priorities. This marked the start of a new period with more challenges than before. As income fell in many households, rent revenue dropped. Public housing relied on rent for maintenance. Lower income meant less money to repair roofs, restore walls, and replace aging systems. This created a slow strain on the buildings. Some developments built in the 1940s and 1950s reached an age where repairs were needed. Pipes wore out, elevators needed new parts, heating systems required updates. But funds for repairs did not grow with the need. NYCHA leaders sent reports to city and federal officials. They warned that the system needed more support. They showed evidence of rising costs, but responses were slow or reduced by other priorities. Another factor came from new rules that allowed families with very limited income to apply. This rule was created to help those in the most need. Many families benefited from it, but it also increased the financial pressure on the system. These pressures grew quietly year after year. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, federal housing policy shifted. New programs encouraged private development. Funds for new public housing construction were reduced. Cities were urged to explore other options.
New York still had a large system to manage, but it no longer had support to expand or rebuild aging structures. Developments that needed upgrades waited. Some repairs were delayed. Federal officials also introduced stricter rules about how local housing authorities could spend money. This added more strain to NYCHA's operations. Local leaders argued that these rules limited flexibility, but the rules remained in place. This marked a clear turning point. The system was large, aging, and underfunded. The city had limited tools to fix it. Residents felt the changes in daily life. Some developments saw longer waits for repairs. This caused stress for parents who wanted safe homes for their children. Some residents wrote letters to officials asking for help. At the same time, many families held strong pride in their homes. They kept apartments clean. They organized tenant groups. They worked with building staff to address problems. Tenant associations became an important voice during this period. They pushed for better repairs. They held meetings with NYCHA leaders. They worked to protect services in their developments. Many residents carried fear about the future. They knew the system faced pressure. They hoped the city and federal government would protect it. They understood the value public housing had given to their families. This emotional mix defined the period. Hope, stress, pride, and uncertainty lived together in the same hallways. During the 1960s and 1970s, researchers studied how building design affected daily life. They found that extremely large developments presented management challenges. Some had long corridors that were hard to supervise. Some had open areas that lacked clear purpose. These findings were not judgments on residents. They were observations about how design influenced safety and community life. NYCHA reviewed these studies and adjusted plans for newer buildings, but earlier developments were already built and required costly upgrades. This research influenced planning for years to come. It showed that design mattered as much as maintenance. It also showed that large developments needed strong support systems. These lessons would guide later chapters of the system's history. By the late 1970s, the challenges reached their peak. New York faced a major fiscal crisis. The city struggled to pay for basic services. Public programs across the city saw cuts. NYCHA managed to avoid the most severe cuts because of strong internal controls. It protected many core services. It continued essential repairs. It kept most buildings stable during the crisis. But the pressure was clear. The system carried more responsibility with fewer resources. Developments aged faster than the budget allowed. Communities needed more support than the city could offer. This period tested the promise of public housing. It showed the strength of residents and staff. It revealed structural issues that would shape future decisions.